Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. Today's webinar is Time to Think Small with Todd Myers. My name is Angela, and I am republicEn's Engagement Director. Just want to give you guys a quick rundown of today's event. We're going to have a welcome. We'll go into the speaker presentation. We'll have about 30 minutes for audience Q&A. And as many of you remember, a few weeks ago, we were giving away copies of Todd's book. Well, I had 2 of those that never were claimed. So if you stay all the way to the end of today's presentation, I am going to give away those last 2 books, but you have to be here to win them. So if you're here, I'm going to be doing another drawing to give away those 2 books. So just to give you guys an idea of the Q&A, we ask that you please type questions and comments in the chat function. We keep everybody on mute, and then we feed those questions to Todd. And don't worry, we're really good about getting everybody's questions out there and answered. So today's webinar is presented by republicEn.org. We are a home for conservatives who care about climate change and want to take action. So now I'm going to turn the mic over to our executive director and former Congressman, Bob Inglis.
Thanks, Angela. And we're excited to have Todd Myers with us today. Very interested in what he's going to share with us. And it seems appropriate given Earth Day coming up and our hope of free enterprise innovation solving climate change. Actually, it's more than a hope. It's really a strategy. Free enterprise can do that if we make it accountable, is what we say at republicEn.org. And so if I could just also invite you, if you haven't yet joined us at republicEn.org, please do so. It takes about 45 seconds at that website, republicEn.org. All we need is your email address to keep in touch. Don't worry, we won't hound you for money. We've got folks that take care of us in that way. But we do want to stay in touch, and we need your zip code so that we can make you visible and audible to your member of Congress. They're beginning to get it that you exist, conservatives who care about climate change, but they need to know that you really are there. And so join us if you would, and very excited about what Todd can share with us today. And
get from here. So thank you very much for that nice introduction. It's very nice to be here. I live in Washington State and have worked on environmental policy for about 23 years now. Started working at the Washington State Department of Natural Resources. I currently sit on the Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Council, where we're trying to get more salmon back. And then actually just earlier today, I'm a member of the Hanford Advisory Board in Washington State, which is part of the cleanup of the Hanford nuclear site, making weapons during the Cold War. And so I've worked in a lot of different areas related to environment, and obviously climate and energy is one of those. And one of the things, as somebody who works, who is on the center right and works for a market-based think tank, I get a couple of questions all the time, which is one, why don't conservatives care about climate and the environment? And in fact, we do. And what you see is that people on the center right live that every day. There are numerous studies that show that the more you rely on government to solve these problems, the less you do in your daily lives. And that the less you rely on government, the more you feel obliged to do. And I think that's really important. And conservatives need to embrace that. But too often, people on the center right are skeptical about climate change and other issues like that because they fear that it is a Trojan horse for socialism or for policies that they don't like. And so that's one of the reasons that I wrote this book, Time to Think Small, is to say, no, You can embrace the environmental stewardship that you live every day of your life and do it in such a way that is consistent with your values and effective, environmentally effective. And many of the things that we see conservatives do are very effective, more effective for the environment. So Bill is saying that he's getting, the audio is bad. Is audio fine for others? Give me a thumbs up. Okay, great. All right. So anyway, so hopefully you can fix that. But let me go ahead and I will share my screen, and we can talk about why it is that market-based approaches to the environment are more effective. And are you seeing you're seeing my presentation? Thumbs up? Excellent. Okay. So I will talk about this woman here a little bit toward the end. But I think that there are numerous good examples of how small technology is empowering individuals to do things for the environment where previously we thought only government could. And the beauty of this approach is not merely that it is consistent for conservatives with their ideological approach, but it is more effective and more aligned with prosperity. And there's a variety of reasons for that. But the first thing I want to do is start with a story. So last September, California was facing an energy crisis. They had a shortage, it was very hot weather, and they had energy shortages. And so they did something that they hadn't done before, at least at this scale, was send a text to a lot of residential customers to say, look, we're facing shortages, please conserve where you can. That's it. Just a simple text. Not telling them they had to, but asking them to please do that. And what happened over the next 15 minutes is that demand fell by 2,000 megawatts. And you can see in the chart here on the left how rapidly that decline occurred just based on one text. The chart on the right is to put that in context. Okay, so what is 2,000 megawatts? Well, California at that time had about 3,000 megawatts of installed battery grid scale capacity. It's now up to about 4,000. But what I show there is that at about that time, right, they were using a lot of battery capacity, and one text was equivalent to about 2/3 of the grid scale battery capacity they had at that time. Think about all the money, all the billions of dollars that we have spent on batteries in California, and one text was able to do that. Now, obviously, that's just one moment in time. It's not the same as batteries, but one of the critiques that we get all of the time of market-based approaches and of lots of little incentives is that it can't make a big difference. Right, that only government can make the scale of difference and change that is necessary to address climate change and a variety of other problems. And I think this is about as clear as an example as you can get, that with something as simple as a text, even without a financial reward, a direct financial reward, you can have a really big impact and find a way to reduce energy use. And in this case, also CO2 emissions, because peak hours is typically when they're turning on natural gas, what are called peaker plants. So not only are peak hours the most expensive, they're also the most carbon intensive. And if you can tell people, look, use less electricity during these peak hours, you're not only saving them money by reducing energy use at the most expensive period of time, but you're also reducing carbon emissions, even in California. But as I say, the standard approach is that only government can do the things we need to do at the scale that we need to do them. And I just want to tell a story about the Flint water crisis to say that if you think that government is always on your side or looking out for you, think again. It is better to have power in your own hands to make decisions, and often more effective than to rely on government. So many people are familiar with the Flint water crisis. The city of Flint, Michigan was looking for a way to reduce costs, so they switched the source of water for the community. What they didn't realize is that the new water source was more corrosive. Now, that didn't have to be a problem. They could have adjusted for it. Many communities adjust for that and put chemicals in there to reduce corrosion of pipes, but they didn't do it because they didn't realize. But pretty soon, people started getting water coming out of their pipes, like you see in this photo here. But even then, government was slow to respond, and the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality was asked about what was going on in Flint, and they said, anyone concerned about lead in the drinking water can relax. Well, that turned out to be wrong. There was lead in the drinking water, and there were other pollutants. And so finally, the EPA and others realized that something was wrong, and they started to negotiate and figure out how to do this. And in the regional EPA office, they said, well, we have this little bucket of money. It's not intended for purchasing water filters and other things like that, but we could probably justify it. And so there was an internal debate. And during that internal debate, they finally decided not to do it. And there was one email actually sent by somebody in the office that said, we could probably justify this, but quote, I'm not sure Flint is the kind of community we want to go out on a limb for. Right? I mean, they actually had a solution there, but they knew that they would have to stretch the politics a little bit in the use of this, and they just weren't willing to do that. So when you think about what government can do to address environmental problems, I have worked for government agencies. I'm not denigrating the work that they do, but I also recognize that there are limits and that there are pressures on them about what they can do and how they can act. And I think the Flint water crisis is a perfect example of where everybody acknowledged something was going wrong. Everybody acknowledged that something had to happen. And yet at that moment, both the state and federal government failed. And even worse, after it was resolved and there were hearings in Congress, the former EPA regional director testified, I don't think anyone at EPA did anything wrong. So I think it's a perfect example of where if you put all your eggs in one basket, if what you say is, I'm not worried because the EPA has my back, you may be surprised, and that it is often better to put power in the hands of individuals to take care of risks to themselves and environmental issues because they have stake in the game. And they're going to be more careful about environmental protection than even the EPA. And this brings me to climate change. Climate change is contentious. And the problem is that a lot of what our climate policy is based on is the politics of the day. If your strategy for climate change is contingent on your party winning every election, you're going to be disappointed because they're not going to win every election. And even where governments have committed to meeting targets, it's often very difficult to meet those targets. The most recent example, of course, is in Germany, where they've shut down their nuclear power plants and their carbon emissions for electricity have gone up. But the Paris Climate Accords, very few countries are meeting those targets. Certainly the United States is not, but actually Canada is even farther behind than us. European countries are not. And so even when there is a commitment to meet those targets and to take action, it is often hard to live up to those promises. And since I'm from Washington State, I particularly like to give the example of Governor Inslee. Governor Inslee is very outspoken about climate change. It is his number one issue. It's what he talks about all the time. He ran for president in the last election, specifically on that one issue. And yet, he has been in office now since, 10 years now. And we only have data through 2019. But every year that we have data for, CO2 emissions have gone up since he has been governor. And his response to that was they used to have a page called Results Washington, where the governor was supposed to show the results of what's going on in a number of different areas, environmental and otherwise. And when he ran for president, right before he announced, they removed that webpage from the state's webpage to hide the fact that they were failing to meet these targets. So it is very difficult for something as important as climate change, as important as environmental issues, if you are relying on political action and not giving power to individuals, you are making a bet that even for people who claim that climate change is their number one issue, often don't live up to. So what's going on here? In too many cases, politics is trumping the environment. The decisions that are made, and these are complicated decisions, I don't mean to downplay that. They're complex, there are lots of trade-offs, there's lots of uncertainties. And in those circumstances, even the most sincere politician will have a difficult time understanding what the right path is, what right path forward is. And so what they tend to go to is what is politically comfortable, especially if there are particular groups whispering in their ear about what they would prefer. Those paths are not always the best for the environment. And in climate, this problem is particularly acute because Gallup in 2016 actually did a poll and found that climate change was the most divisive issue in the United States. Now, this has changed. Abortion has gone back up since a Supreme Court decision, but it is still one of the most divisive issues in the United States. And think about, we're not going to reduce the risks from climate change overnight. It is going to take a long time. It is going to take sustained effort. And in an environment where the policies are so divisive and the issues are so divisive, it is very difficult to get sustained political effort year after year after year. And so this is not to say that government has no role. I'm not an anarchist. Despite living in Seattle, I am not wearing black. I am not an anarchist. But what it does mean is to the extent that we can empower those who have a personal stake in the game, who are rewarded either financially or personally for reducing CO2 emissions, rather than relying on the political process, we need to do more of that. And the beauty is we have lots of opportunities to do that. So what can we do? It's time to democratize environmentalism. Take our environmental policies and push it down to the level where individuals can make these sorts of decisions. And it's time to think small rather than big government. And I'm not the only one to say this. Bill Ruckelshaus, who was the first director of the EPA, who oversaw some of the most successful government programs for cleaning the environment in the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, wrote in a Wall Street Journal piece, I think in 2010, said, yesterday's solutions worked well on yesterday's problems, but the solutions we devised back in the 1970s aren't likely to make much of a dent in the environmental problems we have today. And the reason is that because rather than point sources where you had big smokestacks, big outfalls into the water, our environmental problems are distributed today. Everybody uses energy and emits CO2 in a slightly different way. Some people drive a lot, some people have carbon-intensive electricity or other things like that. And the solutions for those people are very different. And so that makes it difficult to address climate change in the way that we addressed air pollution in the 1970s. It's not just true about climate change, it's also true about other types of pollution. In an area that I work on, salmon recovery, the problems that face salmon are lots of little things. And in terms of pollution, it's not outfalls. Really, that's not one of the big issues. It's lots of little bit of tire rubber, brake dust, little bits of oil that go into the water and aggregate into an impact on salmon, so that when they are weakened by other things, including warm stream temperatures and things like that, the little bits of pollution sort of can push salmon over the edge. Addressing these types of problems is very different than addressing them in the 1970s. Beauty is we now have the tools to do that in a way that we didn't in the 1970s. And so small technology allows us to get the information and to aggregate the efforts to add up to big things and solve these big problems. And I am a wonk, so I am contractually obligated to cite Nobel Prize-winning economists, and I will cite two of them. The first is Elinor Ostrom, who was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics. And one of the things that she said is what we have ignored is what citizens can do and the importance of real involvement of the people, just versus just having somebody in Washington make a rule. Public involvement is really difficult. Right, I was at the Hanford Advisory Board, of which I'm a member today. We had one person in the audience who was there to give public comment, and boy, did we lay the praise upon them for showing up. One person. So the easier we can make public involvement, the better. and technology allows people to do that. And one of the reasons it does is that it lowers the costs of information, the transaction costs of acquiring information and the costs of collaboration. And for that, I'll quote Ronald Coase. Ronald Coase, his great insight was how those high transaction costs, the cost of information, the cost of collaboration, make it very difficult to coordinate to solve problems. And one of the things that he pointed out is that the governmental administrative machine is not itself costless. It can, in fact, on occasion be extremely costly. So those two insights, I think, set the groundwork for what we're seeing in terms of the opportunity to address environmental problems using technology. So I'll step away from climate for a moment and talk about two other very big distributed environmental problems that are related to climate, but I think are emblematic of the types of challenges, but we're already seeing really big successes. So the first one is ocean plastic. Like I said, climate change is very divisive, very contentious. Ocean plastic is not. Nobody wants to see a lot of plastic in the ocean. There are estimates that by the year 2050, there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish. Now, I have to say, I'm very skeptical of that claim. I think that is exaggerated. But whatever the real number is, what we find is that it's bad. We want to reduce the amount of plastic in the ocean because it doesn't bio or photodegrade. So one of the things that we have to do is identify where the problem is. And what this map shows is scientific research based in part on citizen science, where people are using smartphones and other things like that to say where they find trash and figure out how trash is moving. But the primary sources of trash, plastic trash into the ocean, is Southeast Asia and developing countries like Egypt, Sri Lanka, Nigeria. The reason that's happening is because the government is not very strong. A government solution to this problem simply isn't really very possible. As you can see, the United States is not on that map because we have very good trash collection systems. That's not true in the countries that are listed here and are the primary contributors to ocean plastic. So even looking for a government-based solution just isn't possible. You have to find an alternative. Fortunately, thanks to technology, there is a solution. So a group called Plastic Bank is working in several of the countries that you saw listed there. And what they're simply doing is paying people to pick up plastic trash that is on the beach and turn it in. And they pay folks on their smartphones. More than 90% of people have smartphone or cell phones, I should say, not necessarily smartphones. And you can pay them because a lot of these people don't have bank accounts, but they do have smartphones. And then the second thing is they know where the trash is being picked up because of the collection points and GPS and other things like that. So you can actually go on Plastic Bank's webpage and see exactly where all of this plastic has been picked up and be certain that it was ocean bound or likely to be washed into the ocean or a river in the near term. So think about the technology. Technology is not very complicated. It's smartphones. It's a web page that shows where the plastic was picked up. And then they take that plastic and they recycle it and they sell it to SC Johnson. So when you go to the store, you will see the bottles like you see at the bottom here that have a little sticker that says a 100% ocean-bound plastic. The incentives here are very financial. People are getting paid. SC Johnson gets to put a sticker on that says this is 100% ocean-bound plastic. The technology is decidedly unimpressive, very simple that everybody has. And yet, Plastic Bank has now removed more than 4 billion plastic bottles worth of plastic. This graphic, I need to update it. It says 3.1. That graphic was just from last November. In that short period of time, they have gone from 3.1 billion to 4 billion bottles. Stop. It shows you the power of technology to accelerate reduction of pollution. And if you are using recycled plastic rather than virgin plastic, you are also reducing the demand for natural gas. Just to put that a little bit more in context, there is another group out there that is called the largest cleanup in history. And what they're trying to do is actually pull plastic out of the ocean that is already there. This is a different type of problem, right? It's try to go into the ocean and get plastic out rather than just picking it up on the beach. So it's a little bit apples to oranges, but they have been on late night shows. They have raised millions and millions of dollars. They have nets that they've put in the ocean and also at rivers to catch it. And their total amount of plastic that they have collected, last time I checked, was about 4 million pounds, about a little over 2 million kilograms. By way of comparison, Plastic Bank is about 65 million kilograms. Now, again, I don't do this to denigrate their efforts to pull the plastic out of the ocean. That's very important. It's very difficult. But so often what I hear is these small efforts don't add up. And clearly, small efforts, thanks to the low barriers of action and technology, can add up to make a really big difference. Plastic Bank has not solved the problem of ocean plastic, but it is the best effort that I have seen out there that is making a difference to reduce the amount of plastic in the ocean. Let me give you another example of an issue that is exacerbated by climate change and that we need to deal with, that is being addressed by small technologies. So this is the photo I started with the woman at the pump there. But in many African villages and many rural villages, if they don't have a pump, what has to happen is what you see with the women here on the left. They have to hike to a local stream or river and carry water back, as much water as they can, because they want to make few trips. The United Nations considers 1 kilometer, just over half a mile, to be accessible. So imagine walking a little over half a mile, gathering as much water as you can, holding it on your head like that and carrying it back, often multiple times a day. In terms of time and opportunity, it's very expensive. And then what you have to do is that you have to boil that water because you don't know if it's clean. And so what that involves is cutting down trees and boiling that water, which of course contributes to deforestation. So the other alternative that they have is that they can buy plastic bags of water if they need to know that it's clean. But if you don't have access to clean water, you certainly don't have access to good trash collection. So the plastic bags pile up. So the simple problem of getting access to water is not merely harming these communities because it puts a very high price on water, which is necessary, but there are lots of collateral impacts, either in the form of deforestation or plastic. So the alternative is what was created here on the right, which is a group called E-Water Services. And they created an internet-connected water pump. As I said, large percentages, over 90% of people in a lot of these areas have cell phones. So there's great cell phone coverage. And so what they did is they created a pump that was able to track how much water is being used and whether the pump is working. So what she's holding up there is something like a key fob that you would use to start your car. She has an account. She pays about a penny a day to get water. And by putting a price on that water, it means that she's going to be careful, that she's only going to use as much as she needs. But the other great thing that it does is that if the pump breaks, they will get an immediate signal, and now they're losing money because the pump isn't working. And so E-Water Services works with people in these communities to go and fix the pump. This is a huge problem. The people who are involved in E-Water Services, some of them are from the United Nations, who saw that a large percentage, about 40% of pumps, broke after 18 months in these villages, and the NGO or government who initially put them in often wasn't there to fix them when they broke, or it took them a long time. But when you're losing money, every day that goes by is lost revenue. And so they pointed out that the time to fix these often went from months down to a day. So now not only have you got reliable water at low cost that you know is clean, you know that if it breaks, it's going to be available the next day. And instead of having to hike every day, you know that you're going to have access to it at all hours during the day. And this has been remarkably successful. So this is the dashboard, the live dashboard that I just pulled down last night that you can go on eWater services. They just passed 1 billion liters served to these communities and have served more than 200,000 people in the 3 countries that you see here. But most importantly, as you can see in the lower right-hand corner, 98% of their taps are working. And that gets back to this issue that for a very small amount of money, people can access the water, but if the pump breaks, they're losing revenue. And so the result is that the taps are working and reliable for those who need them. And as countries become more drought stressed and access to water becomes more difficult, simple technologies like this can make it possible for them to get access to the water they need and make their life better. So with that, I think I'll just wrap up and give 3 reasons why the power of thinking small is not just good for ocean plastic or for access to water, but also for providing incentives and harnessing the incentives to do more with less in terms of energy and environment and reduce CO2 emissions. The first thing is small technologies are sustainable and durable. You can't vote technology out at the next election. So for instance, in my electrical panel, I have something called a sense monitor that has 2 clips to the wires going into my house. And I can tell you on my phone at any second of the day exactly how much electricity I'm using and what I'm using it on, because the AI can determine the appliances that I'm using, and it tells me here's areas where you can conserve. Technology and information like that is very valuable. It allows me to reduce how much electricity I'm using in a way that is consistent with my personal financial interest. Barrier to previously doing that was just simply I didn't have the information. And I have to tell you that I'm an energy geek. I think about this stuff a lot. And when I put this in my electrical panel, I was surprised at where some of the electricity I was using and was able to reduce my overall electrical demand. The second thing is adaptable, right? Climate change is a difficult problem. The solutions that work in one place are not going to work in another. And as we have just seen, right, from the technology that's in my panel to rural Africa and Southeast Asia, small technologies and the power of small technology to adapt to local circumstances so that people can help the environment in a way that suits them is remarkable. We need a diversity of ideas, a diversity of solutions. Government is good at solving a few big problems. Diversity is much more difficult for it, and small technologies and the low barriers to innovation that we now have create that diversity of solutions that it is going to be necessary, as the Bill Ruckelshaus quote showed. And last, it connects people with problems directly. Too often what I have seen in working in government is that the incentives for politicians are not necessarily to solve the problem, but to look good. And then sometimes that's just because they don't have the information or the direct connection to the problem in the ways that people on the ground do. Problem was previously the people on the ground didn't have the power to solve the problem in the way government does. Now technology is aligning those personal incentives, that local knowledge with the power to act. And we need to do more to address that. Government has always been the solution. People recognize that there were limitations to government solutions, but they just felt that there were no options. Increasingly, there are those options. And because it connects people on the ground directly to the problems, it now has more opportunity to solve some of those difficult issues than ever before. So with that, I will finish up. I'm sure we could talk. People have a lot of questions about the application of this specifically to climate, but Earth Day is Saturday, and I just wrote a piece that appeared in the Daily Caller that said, on Earth Day, don't march, innovate. And a week from now, not this Saturday, but the following Saturday, I'm actually teaching a session with some folks about how to innovate environmental technologies called Conservation Tech 101. These barriers, like I said, the barriers are so low now that people can act. And rather than feeling disempowered and feeling like that the best way that you can use your voice is to encourage politicians or others to act, people can now act for themselves. Empowerment is good for the environment, and it is consistent with sort of the free market, incentive-based approach that so many of us on the center right support. So, thank you so much.
Thank you, Todd. So let's lead into the Q&A. We do have a smaller group here with us today. And so I kind of threw out the question in the chat. republicEn team, how do you guys feel about just opening it up so that people can unmute and ask the questions themselves and have more of a group roundtable kind of feel? You guys on board with that?
Yep, that works.
You think that sounds good? All right. Let's see. I think I need to change something in the settings that will allow people to unmute. Can someone test it and see if they can unmute?
I just got unmuted. And earlier, Todd, I was trying to pass it off to Chelsea, who is going to introduce me. But somehow the hand from above muted me. So sorry about that. Chelsea would have otherwise given you a glowing introduction. Chelsea, you want to do it now? You want to give a glowing introduction?
I think that Todd basically just said everything that I was going to say, which is that he epitomizes what it means to be eco-right. So you just proved that with your presentation.
There we go.
You would have mentioned that I'm a beekeeper and I make a great dirty martini, but other than that, I think I covered it all.
And that you work for the Washington Policy Center. That's important too.
Yes.
All right, I just hit a button. Can you guys, I'm getting messages that they say they're still muted, but I just changed a setting. Can you guys unmute now? See, Amy G and Michael A. Nope. All right, ask all.
So there are some questions. So while you're doing that, there are some
Okay.
questions that
Sounds
I can go
good.
ahead and read and address here. So one of them is plastic bank profitable, or does it rely more on grants or government funding? And it doesn't rely on government funding that I know of. I think there's two sources. You can contribute. I contribute. They have a thing where you say you can be plastic neutral, where you pay, I think it's $20, and they will basically pick up as much plastic on beaches as the average American or Canadian, they're a Canadian-based company, uses in a year. And so those are just, straight, basically donations, but they are a business model in that they sell the plastic, right? They pay people, they sell the plastic to SC Johnson, to Henkel in Europe, and other folks. So they do definitely have a business approach that they want to be sustainable. Again, that's part of this sustainability. If you are reliant on donations, if you are reliant especially on government funding, the political winds could change, and then you'd be in trouble. So the more that you can rely on a business model, which is, I think, either they do or close to doing, the more likely you are to be sustainable. Let me scroll up. He also had the same person asked a question, do I have examples from the US of technologies that work and that we can use individually? So what are some good sources? There's actually a book about these sorts of things that you should get called Time to Think Small. So I list a bunch of them in there, not just electricity, not just energy, but other approaches. I have a whole chapter actually on transportation, which is a major area of CO2 emissions. And I will digress. I will answer your question, but I'll digress on one thing, which is so often what we hear with transportation, focus on electric vehicles, but there is a lot of focus on public transit. And public transit was always a relatively small portion of trips prior to COVID. Since COVID, that has gone down dramatically. I don't know what it is nationwide. I can tell you here in Washington State, where we put a lot of effort into public transit, ridership is about half what it was before COVID. So if you're relying on people using transit to reduce transportation-related CO2 emissions, that's really struggling. But there are companies, one company called Pantonium in Canada, that they're also working with some cities in the United States that are changing transit and it's sort of on-demand transit. And what they have done is they haven't replaced all of the routes, but some of the static routes, they simply said, okay, we have an app and you can also call in. And what it says is, tell us where you are and then where you need to go and what time you need to be there. And what their algorithm does is dynamically create a route for a bus, a regular size bus, to go and pick up people. And what they found is that instead of having to do the static route, which goes to all sorts of stops where there aren't any people, they could shorten the routes. And so not only were the routes shorter, which meant that customers were happier because they could get where they wanted, but it cut gas by 30%. And so they saved 30% on their gasoline, and they also tripled their ridership, because now a bus wasn't just this static. When you had to meet their time schedule, it could meet your time schedule. So it's the best of both worlds, tripling ridership as well as reducing CO2 emissions. With regard to individual technologies, I mentioned one, Sense. It's called Sense, that you can go, and it cost about $300. Like I said, I was pretty surprised to find out ways I was using electricity. Some of my light bulbs were using way more electricity than I imagined. I swapped those out, saved a lot of money. Smart thermostats, which are not particularly innovative anymore, but they are very powerful. And the great thing is that some utilities are now finding ways to say, okay, if in periods of peak demand, when there's shortages, we'll pay you to either turn up your thermostat or turn down your thermostat 2 degrees. Some people don't like that, feels invasive. I personally think that's only appropriate if it's voluntary, but a lot of utilities have looked at ways of providing financial incentives to back those technologies up, and they work really well. In Portland General Electric out in Oregon did a study and found that using smart thermostats in that way was not only much more effective than other approaches that they took in trying to either incentivize or shame people into reducing electricity use, but it was also more popular. They did surveys afterwards, and there's always some people who say, "It's not for me." I think that's great. Not everything is for everybody, but it was actually much more popular than many of the other utilities programs that are out there. So those are two. There's also technologies that I mentioned on water and other things like that. Keep scrolling down.
I was just gonna ask a question while we scroll.
Yeah.
This really fascinates me, and I know for my own consumption, I got solar panels in December, and I have a 12-year-old Prius that I will drive until it's cost prohibitive to fix it, and then I'll get an EV. And our metro ridership in the Washington, D.C. area definitely also decreased during the pandemic. But it's so nice now. We also got a new station in my town and lots of new trains. And so anytime I have to go into the city now, I take the train because it's faster. There's no price to park. There's no hitting that road that has construction that delays you by 30 minutes or whatever. But these are, the personal choices that I've made and that I can make because I have the income to do that. And so I'm sort of wondering about people that can't afford to buy the technology to either measure their use or take those steps. Like, how do we account for that? Especially because I read something recently that said, even if we stopped emitting CO2 today, we don't stop climate change. There's like some global warming that's like built in
Right.
for the next, several decades. So how do we do enough fast enough, kind of with some of those limitations, to make the smaller technology approach work?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. First, as you said, some people can't afford to do these things. Well, that's true. With many of the government policies, they still pay those costs, and so they are less. Right? There's ways that people try to avoid the cost on low income and shift them. But I mean, there's always going to be these costs to shifting how people use energy and those sorts of things. So I want to make sure that we recognize that managing those costs is a problem, whether you use innovative solutions or whether you use government solutions. But innovative solutions, I think, are more adaptable and more able to deal with that, and for a couple of reasons. First is, as I mentioned, just with the case of Pantonium and the buses, the people who were riding those buses were not the wealthy people, right? They were the working class. They were people who were riding buses because it was the most affordable. And ridership tripled, which means that they liked it. So it improved the usability of transit and responsiveness to some people who don't have a lot of disposable income. So a lot of these technologies actually can reduce CO2 emissions in a way that is suitable to exactly the type of people that you're talking about. And the other thing, of course, is that I am an early adopter, right? So I have disposable income. I'm a geek. I'm willing to pay more than I probably should for some of these cool technologies. I have a bird feeder with a camera on it called Bird Buddy because I think it's cool. Not every bird watcher is going to do something like that. I have a sense. Washington State has the lowest electricity rates in the country, and we have, I think, the most decarbonized electricity in the country because we have hydro. I shouldn't say never. I will probably never make back the money that I spent on that sense. Doesn't matter to me. People like me who are either, you can call them early adopters or dumb, help technology integrate to the point where it's available to everybody. And in fact, Sense is a good example. Sense just over the years has improved its algorithm, and now that is being integrated into smart meters built by Itron and then one other company. So that technology, people like me funded the research essentially to create the AI that is now being included in smart meters for everyone. So I think that those two aspects of market innovation are really positive. One, that it does create opportunities for people to reduce CO2 emissions who don't have disposable income. And it harnesses the disposable income of people like me to create technologies that then become mainstream.
Just going to acknowledge that we have two people with their hands raised. And thank you, Todd, for your answer. Elizabeth, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. And glad to be here. Glad to see you, Mr. Inglis, Bob. I saw you. I saw you in person in Coronado back when Marshall Saunders was alive. There was an event down there, and so I'm with CCL. Been there with CCL for 8 years. You may know us as the carbon fee people, and I'll get to that. I just want to say, Todd, that I totally understand where you're coming from. We've worked with the government the group has worked with the government for 13 years and tried to get this. And you're absolutely right in every point you make about the political cycle. One point is that your slide said the state sent a text. So it was the state, and it was the Flint City Council that so government and the people have to work together. And what you mentioned too about sort of the elite costs of this technology, the people who can put in a sensor on their houses. All of this works if you put a price on carbon. If you have to put a price on carbon to make carbon more expensive for people to make those choices, because without it, people of goodwill are going to do it, and others. So how do you solve the problem of adoption on a scale that's meaningful?
That is a great question. Now, when I get that question, people's definition of meaningful always plays a big role. People have a different definition of how fast we need to decarbonize and the costs that they're willing to pay and all those sorts of things. So I'll set that aside. But I think two things. The first is, so I actually supported a revenue neutral carbon tax in Washington State in 2016. It is worth noting that Governor Inslee opposed it. And the reason he opposed it was, as much as he talks about concern about climate change and it being an existential crisis, he cared more about the taxes and increasing the taxes than he did the price on carbon. And so,
just a second, was that the first round?
yes,
Was that the one
2016.
that was the one that Sierra Club opposed?
Yes, and Governor Inslee too. And so I think so those sorts of politics do intervene. So this is not to say that carbon taxes and revenue neutral carbon taxes are bad. It's just to say that there's politics involved in that. The second thing is, so I've supported revenue neutral carbon taxes. I think Steve Kahn, who is with Citizens Climate Lobby in Washington State, really nice guy. I've talked with him many times. So I have a good relationship with Citizens Climate Lobby. But the second thing I think technology does, the challenge of setting a carbon price is that people feel like, okay, we've got to set it very high to create the incentive to overcome the inelasticity of demand for gasoline and electricity. And so you want to set it like $1 a gallon or something very high. People debate this, but that's the thing is that they tend to want to set that price based on what can create the behavioral response that they're looking for. What technology does, though, is that it makes price signals and existing price signals more effective. When gasoline prices go up, everybody knows. If I asked everybody on this call what the gas price is in their community, they would all know because they see it 5 times a day. If I asked everybody on this call what they pay for a kilowatt hour, okay, this group is different than the public, but I'm willing to bet that even in this group, some people would not know. And if you ask the public, they don't even know what a kilowatt hour is. So now if you can use technology to give people that information and the ability to respond to it, now instead of having to set carbon prices at $100 a metric ton or even $50 a metric ton, you can achieve a response much lower. And so the example of California, where they just simply sent a text and people responded, I think shows the power of information to make those decisions and have a big impact. But the reason that we feel we have to set carbon prices so high is to make the signal clear. And technology and information can help make that signal clear without having to raise that price so high. So I think even to your point, even if carbon tax is necessary to provide the response and the reduction at the rate that some people want, technology makes it possible to do that more effectively and rapidly at a lower economic cost.
I will say I do have with my solar panels an app where I can see how much power I'm generating versus how much I'm importing versus how much I'm exporting. And when I first got it, I was checking it like multiple times a day and unplugging my son's computer because he's at college and the downstairs TV because he's the only one that ever watches it. And just looking for like those small changes. And it actually really just took like some sunny days for me to see that number go up. I wanted to turn it over to Michael Cooper, has his hand raised for a question, perhaps.
Yeah, I have a question, and it might not be thinking so small, maybe go up a little bit more to community level. Now, there are a ton of companies around the United States that I know of that they're energy consultants. They help individuals with energy processes of putting in solar panels and what have you. Do you know of any that work with communities? I'm thinking of Babcock Ranch in Florida, which was famous for withstanding ion when it came aboard. Came on shore in Florida, not too far from Babcock Ranch is not too far from Fort Myers, where that storm came on, and it survived. And it survived because it prepared with solar. It's up completely solar. It's got raised roads. it's a resiliency thing as well as a progressive thing as far as solar power and things like that. Are there any companies, organizations, anything like that working on microgrids or things that could help communities out?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think there's two aspects to the question you ask. The first is the resiliency. So you talked about the storm, and actually in Brooklyn, I talk about in my book, the Brooklyn microgrid. And the Brooklyn microgrid initially was designed to create resiliency from, I think it was Superstorm Sandy, but to do exactly what you're talking about. So the power goes out, they still have some solar, they have other types of electricity, and so it creates that backup resiliency. And microgrids are good at doing that. Now, like any sort of backup, if you have a backup generator, that's going to cost you money. So the purpose in those resiliency situations for microgrids, it's not cheaper. It costs more, but it provides that certainty. And if you're a hospital or you're a community or things like that, it's worth it. So that's one part, and microgrids are doing that more and more. But what we're finding, actually, the cool thing, again, this gets to sort of the early adopters, is that the technology necessary to make microgrids work is now becoming more mainstream and easier. And so what you see in Brooklyn and what you see in other places is, and around the world, is that people can now trade electricity amongst themselves. So this is a little bit larger, but in Texas, when they had the Texas energy crisis, there was a utility called Octopus USA, and they, as the retail prices went through the roof, as the energy shortage hit, they were passing those on to people who had solar panels, and saying, look, if you conserve and send us more of your solar energy, we will pay you. And in real time, people can now do that because the information is so available. I'll give you another example. Octopus UK, actually, which is the same company, but it's based in the UK, now has what they call their fan club. So they have wind turbines in different parts of the country, not too many, but if you sign up for their fan club, when the turbines are turning, they will send you a message that says your prices are going down because the turbines are turning. And if it's a really windy day and it's generating a lot of electricity, it'll go down again. I think all of that gets to the point that you're talking about, which is the ability to create microgrids for resiliency and for individuals to do things that only utilities could do 10 years ago. I mean, think that's not a very long amount of time, 10 years really. And yet what was simply impossible 10 years ago for people to do, now I can adjust my demand based on whether a wind turbine is turning somewhere. It's really remarkable, and it makes the types of things you're talking about possible, either for resiliency or to reduce your CO2 emissions.
Can we do one more question?
Yeah, I don't have a time limit. You guys probably have more of a time limit than I do. And if people don't get their questions, they can certainly email me and I'm happy to answer.
So I was going to turn it over to Joel Schroeder. Joel, did we lose you?
You waited all that time.
I'm here. Do you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Well, one of your previous answers made me think of something, but I'd just like you to kind of reflect and maybe straighten me out a little bit. Sometimes, in my past, when I used to call people communists because they believed in climate change and all kinds of really mean things that I said, and all the things that we as Republicans have done to, try really hard to keep anything being done about climate change. Sometimes I feel like now that those of us who are on board on doing something about it, we still are really excited about worrying about the speck in the Democrat's eyes rather than the log in our own eye. And, I just sort of appreciate Bob's humility sometimes and recognize that we as Republicans are like a huge problem here. Like we're a really big problem in this whole situation. And pointing out the few times the Democrats have screwed it up too, I'm not sure is helpful. Maybe it is helpful. I don't know, but just, I just am wondering, do we need to have a real stance of humility as Republicans, say, we've been wrong, we screwed this up, we've stopped this, and now we're trying to work really hard to get it back rather than finding every opportunity to throw a stone when we've been sort of the big problem for many, many years. Maybe that's kind of outside the scope of your book probably, and maybe we don't want to have to address that, but it's just something I think about sometimes when dealing with this issue.
So let me say this. So I'm on the center right. I believe in the power of markets, and I also believe that the purpose of government is to give people the freedom to live their lives, but pay for the impacts that they cause. And so environmental impacts are part of that. But if you want conservatives and other people who are skeptical of government action to act on climate change or other environmental issues, I think that you have to speak to them where they are. And I think the challenge with political solutions is that it is difficult to get agreement, even if people agree on the problem. It is difficult to get agreement on the solutions. And so if you could tell people, if you can use tools like technology to bring people in who say, I think climate change is a hoax, but I want to save money, then I think the answer is great. And one of the things that we see all the time in environmental policy is that anytime somebody disagrees with somebody else, it's because they are a tool of the socialist left or the big oil right or things like that. And it is all about motives. And what happens when you get into politics is personal feelings and people's personal sense of self gets in the way. And to the extent that we can overcome that and give people tools to overcome that, that's positive. And so I do, right? In Washington State, I have seen many government policies that have failed. And it frustrates me that every year that Governor Inslee has been in office, CO2 emissions have gone up, and yet we keep doing the same thing. So fundamentally, I think there has to be accountability. I think, to your point, if the purpose of calling out those things is just to own the libs, then that's a problem. If the purpose of those things is to provide accountability and say these things aren't working, that's absolutely necessary. So it can be a fine line, but the closer you put solutions to individuals who have stake in the game, the more likely you are to get accountability and the more likely you are to get effectiveness. So I certainly appreciate the concern that you have that attacking the left is a way to distract from the failure of the right to act on some of these things and to take them seriously. But at the same time, I also think that we need to have accountability for what works and what doesn't. And so I understand how that can be a fine line, but I think it's also necessary.
I get made fun of for my electric car and my electric scooter, and I can thank Republicans for that, right? I have a wonderful car that smokes every other gas car in this town. It's cheaper than all the F-150s in this town. My electric scooter is super fun to ride, and it will last a long time. And when I go to the grocery store and someone says, "Oh, electric scooter, how's your battery going to die instantly on that?" They are. Thank you, Republicans, for that. You know what I mean? So I just feel like we got to really clean up the log, because it is actively makes it harder for me to convince people how owning an electric car or for riding an electric scooter is a good idea when their politics are pushing them to mock me for it.
And I think the question to you is, how do you think what's the more likely way to make progress on reducing CO2 emissions? overcoming that politics or providing those same people tools to where they can see the benefit of reducing their own CO2 emissions by saving money without having to admit that they're wrong. Getting people to admit that they're wrong in politics is very hard. And I think that the technology approach of empowering people to do better for the environment in a way that doesn't engage, that doesn't force people to change their politics is far more likely to be effective than confronting people directly, because what we find is, and studies show this, the more you confront people on their politics, the more entrenched they become. So I don't disagree. Like, I understand what you're saying, and I will tell you, it frustrates me because I am an environmentalist, and I talk about this with folks all the time on the right. That's my audience primarily, and I get the same pushback. So I'm not dismissing your frustration or saying it's not real. I just think the better way to deal with that pushback is with a carrot rather than a stick.
All right. Thank you, Todd. And thank you for everybody that has hung around and stayed a little bit late. I did tell you guys we were going to do a drawing for 2 of Todd's books. And so let's go ahead and do that really quick, because you guys have been, I know that's why you guys have stuck around. It's not because you like to hear what Todd's saying. It's because you've been waiting to win one of his books here. So I've got my trusty wheel of names up there. Let's see if it'll work with me sharing. Oh, all right. So who's going to be our first winner? Kathy, are you still here, Kathy?
I am still here.
All right, Kathy, you have just won yourself one of Todd's books. Yay!
That is amazing. Thank you, Todd.
Watch for an email from me, Angela at republicEn.org, asking you for your address so I can drop that to you in the mail. If you don't see it today or tomorrow, be sure to check your spam, because sometimes my emails will wind up in there. Okay, so now we have to do one more, right? Oh. Joel, it looks like you want a book. Did Joel leave us?
No, he's right there.
Okay.
Oh, I'm here.
I didn't see him. All right, Joel. I'll be in touch with you, but my emails probably will go to you without a problem. So for those of you who don't know, Joel has been, he was part of Chelsea's Eco-Right leadership program and a spokesperson. Yeah. So he's been involved with republicEn off and on, like in depth. So Joel's somebody who shows up a lot in our emails and our feed, and we recognize the actions that he takes a lot within our community. So yeah, Joel, yay, you want a book. I'll be emailing you too to get your address to send it. All right, awesome, guys. So like I said, thank you so much, Todd, for coming and being here with us today. It was really an interesting conversation, made me think about a lot of different things. Thank you everybody else who came and attended and stayed and hung out until the end. We really thank you for being part of the republicEn community, and just keep on participating in polls, sending letters, reading our emails, reading Chelsea's weekend review, and that's that. We couldn't ask for more. Thanks, guys. Have a good rest of your day.
See ya. Thanks, Todd.